Grant versus Lee at the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable, the age-old question. The two best-known generals of the war. The commanders who battled one another at the end of the war. Lee's surrender to Grant is generally and incorrectly considered the end of the war. Given his besting of Lee, is Grant the better general? Much has been written over the years, yet the question remains. Lee, second in his West Point class, an engineering officer, a career military officer, truly was a great general. As a tactician, he was head and shoulders above Grant. Thomas, however, is another question. Good defensively. Lee was even better on the offensive. He was bold and decisive, a calculating gambler. Can anyone who has studied the Battle of Chancellorsville deny it? Splitting his army on several occasions, he surprised his opponents and won the day. Lee was a master of the holding attack, a tactic George Marshall would later instill as the only tactic taught at the Army War College prior to World War II, as do all great generals. Lee knew his commanders and his opponents. With Jackson as his right arm, he had the confidence to divide his command and attack whenever he saw the opportunity. After Jackson's death, he realized his subordinates were not cut from the same cloth. Never again would he attempt a Chancellorsville-type maneuver. He was a wise evaluator of his opponent's capabilities. Also, prior to Antietam, with McClellan again in command, Lee knew he would have time to take Harper's Ferry before McClellan attacked. At Gettysburg, Lee realized Meade was a solid, if not spectacular, commander who would likely not make a mistake. Because of these traits, he won battles, one of the measures of a great general. His men loved him and would do anything for him. They fought when they were cold, tired, hungry, and hopeless. They did everything he asked, except win the war. However good he was, Lee was flawed. Two flaws in particular come to mind, one minor, one major. As a minor flaw, Lee was not a good quartermaster. The Army of Northern Virginia was always poorly equipped. Much of its equipment and supplies were taken from the Army of the Potomac after their numerous victories. But there was never enough. Not all of this blame can be laid at the feet of Lee, though. The Confederacy was woefully short of the industry needed to supply its armies, and the Northern blockade prevented adequate supplies from being imported as the war dragged on. Some may lay additional fault on the South's lack of railroads to deliver supplies. Virginia, however, did not suffer from this lack. Finally, Northern Virginia was fought over so much that it simply could not feed the army. While these factors played a role, Lee, as commander, shoulders much of the blame. He never seemed overly concerned about the supply situation, leaving it to the government in Richmond. For instance, a major reason Lee invaded the North in 1863 was the lack of food to be found in northern Virginia following the wintering of both armies there. Rather than deal with the supply problem at home, he chose to invade Pennsylvania and live off the land. But how long could he possibly stay? This only solved part of his problems. More important, a battle was inevitable. He would have to return to deal with his wounded and replace his losses. Even if he were victorious. Lee's major flaw, though, was as a strategist. In a word, he was not. His concern was Northern Virginia and nothing else. Throughout the war, he resisted attempts by Jefferson Davis to draw forces from the Army of Northern Virginia to reinforce the Western armies. Only once did it happen, when Longstreet went west and fought at Chattanooga, but not without Lee's efforts to stop it. He also opposed attempts to make him commander-in-chief of Southern forces until it was too late for it to be of any benefit. Additionally, and most importantly, he failed to realize that the Confederacy's best hope of survival was to hold out. Since the South had a lack of fighting men compared to the North, its best hope was to keep casualties to a minimum, to live to fight another day. Lee's offensive tactics ensured the Army of Northern Virginia sustained greater casualties than it could afford. Had he fought defensively most of the time, Lee would have saved soldiers who could fight again. perhaps outlasting the North's will to win in some ways. Grant is the mirror image of Lee. He was a mediocre student, 21st in a class of 39, and a failure as a career military man. He was not very good as a civilian either, failing as a farmer and a president. And unlike Lee, he was a good quartermaster who made certain his men were well supplied. In other ways, they were very much alike. Like Lee, Grant was decisive and bold. The Vicksburg campaign alone proves this. Grant also was not afraid to fight. He won battles, and his men loved him. Grant also had his flaws. As a tactician, he was horrible. He seemed to know only one tactic: the frontal assault. Time and time again, he threw troops at entrenched positions only to suffer incredible casualties. At Vicksburg, he attacked strong fortifications and suffered accordingly. Did he learn to try other methods? No. At Spotsylvania and Cold Harbor, he did it again on an even grander scale, suffering even grander casualties. Grant seems to be one of those Civil War generals, of whom there are quite a few, who did not understand the changes the rifled musket forced on tactics. Frontal assaults no longer worked, but many a general seemed to think if only another division were thrown in, the result would be different. Only once did Grant try a flank attack. At Chattanooga, Sherman was to strike the right flank of Bragg's army, but was defeated by Claiborne's division. Seeing it fail, Grant seems to have discarded the idea as antiquated. Grant's true talent lay as a strategist. He saw the big picture clearly. His Vicksburg campaign was brilliant, even though the battles were won in a pedestrian manner. He outmaneuvered his opponent and prevented him from combining forces. As commander of all the armies in 1864, Grant understood two aspects of the war that those before him did not. First, the North had to keep pressure on all of the South's armies simultaneously to keep the Confederacy from using its interior lines of communication to shift forces quickly. Second, he realized the North had greater manpower and could replace its losses more easily than the South. If he kept pressure on Lee's army and kept it fighting, eventually Lee would run out of men. While this increased Grant's casualties in the short term, it shortened the war and lessened overall casualties. So who was the better general? Both were fighters who won battles. Both were decisive, bold men. Lee was clearly the better tactician. In the end, however, Grant must be seen as the better of the two. No man, other than Lincoln, did more to win the war than Grant. His strategic vision enabled him to maximize his advantages and Lee's disadvantages. He forced Lee to fight and continue fighting without rest. Grant could replace his losses, Lee could not. In the end, this is what proved the difference. At Appomattox, the Army of the Potomac continued to grow stronger. The Army of Northern Virginia could field no more than 20,000 men, many of whom could no longer fight. As a result of Grant's strategic talent, the Army of the Potomac was able to do the one thing Lee's Army of Northern Virginia could not win: the war. Why Grant won and Lee lost to Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee were the generals primarily responsible for the outcome of America's Great Civil War, superseded in overall importance only by their respective presidents, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Grant and Lee were the key players on the war's battlefields because Southerners were more greatly affected by the war and had a need to rationalize its origins and results. Southern-oriented historians dominated Civil War historiography for the first century after the war. They created the myth of the lost cause and designated Lee as the god of this mini-religion. Their creation was so effective that many Americans have perceived Lee as the greatest general of the war. And perhaps in American history, while Grant often was denigrated and rebuked as a butcher, a drunk, and a victor by brute force alone, this article presents a different view of the performances of Grant and Lee as Civil War generals. Grant, a national general, was the most successful Union or Confederate general of the war. he drove the Confederates from the Mississippi Valley, the primary Western theater of the war, through a series of brilliant battles and campaigns, from the early capture of forts Henry and Donelson through the unparalleled Vicksburg campaign. Then it took him a mere month to save a Union army trapped in Chattanooga and drive the rebels there back into Georgia with a giant assist from Lee. Finally, Grant was brought to the east to face Lee's army, which he defeated within a year to effectively bring the war to a close. Although Lee has been praised for his offensives against the Union Army of the Potomac, he was carrying out an aggressive strategy with aggressive tactics that were inconsistent with what should have been a Confederate grand defensive strategy. The Union, not the Confederacy, had the burden of winning the war, and the South, outnumbered about 4-1 in white men of fighting age, had a severe manpower shortage. Nevertheless, Lee acted as though he were a Union general and attacked again and again as though his side had the burden of winning, and also had an unlimited supply of soldiers. Lee's aggressiveness resulted in a single general's record 209,000 casualties for his army, 55,000 more than Grant's. Those were casualties the South could not afford. After Lee's first 14 months of command, the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia had incurred an intolerable 98,000-plus casualties by the close of the Gettysburg campaign. These losses left Lee's army too weak to effectively stymie Grant's overland campaign to Richmond and Petersburg in 1864, and eventually resulted in Lee's surrender. On April 9, 1865, ironically, Grant, who could not even obtain a command at the beginning of the war, rose to the top of the Union armies and oversaw victories in 3 theaters of war. Lee, on the other hand, started near the top in the Confederate hierarchy of generals, and oversaw the slaughter, decline, and surrender of his army, despite the fact that the rest of the Confederacy was drained of soldiers to replace those killed and wounded under Lee's command. A study of the roles and actions of Grant and Lee, and the interplay between their activities throughout the war, is critical to an understanding of their positive and negative influences on the war's outcome. The antebellum experiences of these 2 generals affected their Civil War careers. Grant's small-town childhood was unremarkable. His first military career ended in an alcohol-related resignation and disgrace, and his 7 years of civilian jobs immediately prior to the Civil War were marked by uninterrupted failure. Although Lee's childhood was marred by his father's abandonment of the family, their survival on intro-family charity, and his father and brother's scandalous behavior, he married into the wealthy Washington Custis family, had a successful 32-year antebellum military career, and was recognized as one of the nation's leading military officers when the Civil War erupted. Grant and Lee's Mexican War experiences were marked by both similarities and differences. Both of them performed heroically and were awarded multiple brevet, temporary, and honorary promotions as they played key roles in General Winfield Scott's war-winning campaign from Veracruz to Mexico City. Grant, however, had the advantage of also serving under Zachary Taylor, a less formal and more communicative officer than Scott, in the similarly successful early Mexican War campaigns in Texas and northern Mexico. Because of his disastrous alcohol-related exodus from the Army in 1854, Grant was unable to interest George B. McClellan, John C. Fremont, or anyone else in the Union Army in offering him a commission when the Civil War began. Only by training novice Illinois volunteer regiments was Grant able to earn the attention and respect of Illinois governor and thereby obtain a colonelcy in the Union Army. Lee, on the other hand, had his choice of plum assignments for either side in the Civil War. His mentor, Union General-in-Chief Winfield Scott, offered him command of all Union armies. But then Colonel Lee declined the offer, resigned his United States commission, immediately took command of Virginia's military forces, and soon was appointed the second highest-ranking operational full general in the Confederate Army. In the opening months of the Civil War, therefore, Grant started at the bottom, while Lee started at the top, in Richmond. A desk-bound and frustratedly effectively supervised Virginia operations of other Confederate generals in the early stages of the war. He was particularly disappointed about missing the field action during the rebels' initial victory at First Manassas First Bull Run in July 1861, when at last he was given a field command in northwestern Virginia. Lee failed dismally. At Cheat Mountain in September, he devised a complicated battle plan that resulted in rebel defeat. After other failures and final loss of control in the mountains, that would become the new state of West Virginia. Lee was withdrawn to Richmond and then assigned to improving Confederate defenses in the southeast. Grant, meanwhile, was on a roll. In September 1861, just after the rebels violated Kentucky's neutrality, Grant's troops seized the crucial Kentucky towns of Paducah and Smithland, where the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers respectively meet the Ohio. 2 months later, Grant commanded his first battle at Belmont, Missouri. As he conducted a raid, he relied on diversionary feints to keep the enemy guessing about his intent. When Grant suggested to Major General Henry Halleck that a joint Navy-Army force capture Confederate forts Henry and Donelson on the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers, Halleck told him such a campaign was none of his business. However, after Lincoln tired of Major General George B. McClellan's slows in the East and ordered all Union forces forward, Halleck authorized the attack on Fort Henry within days. Grant and Navy flag officer Andrew Foote launched an amphibious assault and quickly captured the fort. On his own initiative, Grant then moved on to Fort Donelson. Within 2 weeks, he captured that better defended fort and a 14,000-man army in a manner that earned him the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. The February 1862 capture of forts Henry and Donelson was a major blow to the left flank of the Confederacy and ranks among the most significant actions of the Civil War. It earned Grant a promotion to Major General of Volunteers after advancing his Army of the Tennessee deep into the Confederacy to Pittsburgh Landing, or Shiloh. In far southwestern Tennessee, Grant was so focused on moving on to capture Corinth, Mississippi, that he became careless. His army was surprised at Shiloh in April by a massive attack by rebel forces that had been gathered from around the Confederacy. On the first day of bloody Shiloh, Grant saved his army, and on the second he daringly counterattacked and drove the enemy forces from the battlefield and back toward Corinth. Despite its disastrous start, Shiloh was a major strategic and tactical victory for Grant. Adverse public reaction to the numerous casualties at Shiloh led Halleck to take command of the combined armies of Grant. John Pope and Don Carlos Buell relieve Grant of his army command, elevate Grant to a meaningless deputy position under Halleck, and almost cause Grant to resign his commission. Halleck went on to win a hollow victory at Corinth, but then dispersed his huge armies. After Halleck was promoted to General-in-Chief and left for Washington, Grant resumed command of the Army of the Tennessee. He spent most of 1862 protecting his hard-earned territorial gains with the forces left to him in the Mississippi Valley, while the bulk of Western Union troops moved to the middle theater between the Mississippi Valley and Eastern Virginia theaters to repel a rebel invasion of eastern Tennessee and Kentucky. Grant won victories at Iuka and Corinth, Mississippi, with his limited number of troops, while Grant had won significant victories that weakened the Confederate left flank. Lee remained in the background building defenses in the southeast and then, beginning in March 1862, serving as Jefferson Davis military advisor in Richmond. Lee's opportunity for major field command came with Joseph Johnston's wounding on May 31, 1862, at the Battle of Seven Pines Fair Oaks, just outside Richmond. That battle marked the first serious fighting during McClellan's slow and deliberate peninsula Campaign from Fort Monroe and Hampton up the Virginia Peninsula toward Richmond, after assuming command of the Army of Northern Virginia on June 1, 1862. Lee achieved fame and success through victories over McClellan and Major General John Pope, with high casualties. Lee drove McClellan away from Richmond during the 7 days battle and then moved into central and northern Virginia to sweep Pope's army. Undermined by McClellan off the battlefield at 2nd Manassas' Second Bull Run. On his own volition, Lee then overextended his army by invading Maryland, splitting his army into 5 segments, incurring almost 14,000 casualties on a single day at the Battle of Antietam, and retreating back to Virginia. That Maryland-Antietam campaign cost Lee irreplaceable losses and also lost the Confederacy its last real chance for European intervention on its behalf. But for McClellan's cowardly and incompetent conduct, Lee would have lost his army at Antietam. Lee's good fortune in the Union selection of commanders of the Army of the Potomac continued when Ambrose Burnside replaced McClellan and then was replaced by Joseph Hooker. In December 1862, Burnside ordered suicidal Union attacks at Fredericksburg, Virginia. That gave Lee a major defensive victory by the end of 1862. Therefore, both Lee and Grant had won significant victories. But the results of those victories were quite different. Grant's victories at Belmont, Fort Henry, Fort Donelson, Shiloh, Iuka, and Corinth greatly expanded Union control in western Kentucky and Tennessee, as well as northern Mississippi. Grant's successes had been achieved with a little over 20,000 casualties while he imposed more than 35,000 casualties on his opponents. Meanwhile, Lee's victories at the 7 days Cedar Mountain, 2nd Manassas, and Fredericksburg engagements had foiled Union strategic offensives. But his embarrassing Maryland campaign had lost the possibility of European intervention and nearly cost Lee his army. Lee's constant demand for reinforcements and his 50,000 casualties had drained other areas of the South of many of their soldiers. That drainage made Grant's and other Western generals' jobs easier in late 1862 and early 1863. Grant undertook a number of initiatives aimed at capturing Vicksburg, Mississippi, the last significant rebel bastion on the Mississippi River, although stymied at first. He persisted in his efforts and ultimately carried out one of the greatest military campaigns in history. While employing 3 major diversionary feints, Grant moved the bulk of his army down the west bank of the river, conducted a huge amphibious crossing of the river to the Mississippi shore, and headed inland. Although they initially outnumbered Grant in the theater, the befuddled rebels could not ascertain his movements and whereabouts. Thus, he outnumbered and defeated them in each of 5 battles fought in the 18 days following his troops' landing. After 2 unsuccessful assaults on Vicksburg itself, Grant settled into a siege. 6 weeks later, he accepted the surrender of the city and a 28,000-man army, a surrender regarded by many as the most important of the war. Grant's Vicksburg campaign, which gave the Union control of the entire Mississippi Valley, was greatly assisted by Lee. In early May 1863, Lee had repelled a Union offensive commanded by Hooker at Chancellorsville. But rebel frontal assaults on the final days of that battle, often ignored by historians, cost Lee many casualties. Riding the crest of his influence following Chancellorsville, Lee convinced Jefferson Davis to allow him to keep Lieutenant General James Longstreet's First Corps with him in the East for what became his Gettysburg campaign. Longstreet had been seeking new opportunities in other theaters, but Lee argued that Longstreet's corps was needed for an offensive in the East, and that the semi-tropical Mississippi climate would defeat the Vicksburg campaign of Grant, who was sweeping through Mississippi at that very moment. Instead of sending the First Corps to oppose Grant in Mississippi, or even to aid the outnumbered General Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee, Lee retained that corps for his own offensive campaign in the East. Early in June 1863, While Grant besieged Vicksburg, Lee began troop movements toward Pennsylvania. In the ensuing Gettysburg Campaign, Lee committed a series of costly errors, and his army suffered 28,000 casualties before retreating back to Virginia once again. By the close of the Gettysburg Campaign, Lee's cumulative casualties had reached more than 80,000, while he had imposed about 75,000 on his Union opponents, who could afford the losses much more than he. Lee's army thereafter would remain relatively inactive until it faced Grant in 1864, with Lee's assistance in ensuring that his Mississippi Valley foes received no help from the east. Grant completed his Vicksburg campaign with little difficulty. As he had done at Fort Donelson, Grant maneuvered so that he would capture a Confederate army as well as a critical place. Those two armies who surrendered to Grant were the only Civil War armies that surrendered to their opponents before Lee surrendered to Grant at Appomattox. Their surrenders demonstrate Grant's focus on going after enemy armies as well as places, a focus shared by Lincoln and critical to Union victory. After Vicksburg, Grant's cumulative casualties were about 31,000, while he had imposed over 77,000 on his foes. So Grant had gained control over a wide swath of the Western Confederacy and made Confederate armies pay the price for opposing him, while Lee had decimated his own army in a series of strategic and tactical offensives that were unnecessary to the stalemate the Confederacy needed. In late 1863, these two generals' activities became even more intertwined. After the Gettysburg defeat, Lee's political capital ebbed, and he could not prevent the transfer of Longstreet and most of his corps to another theater. The Confederates won significant inter-theater transfer. Lee's opposition, however, resulted in the start of the transfer of those troops from Virginia to northern Georgia being delayed from August 20th to September 7th. That delay proved devastating because Union General Burnside's capture of Knoxville, Tennessee, on September 2nd converted a 2-day rail journey to a 10-day one and kept Longstreet's artillery and most of his troops from arriving in time for the 2-day Battle of Chickamauga in northern Georgia. Those missing troops and guns probably allowed the escape, rather than the destruction of Union Major General William Rosecrans' army, which fled back to Chattanooga, Tennessee. But Lee did even more damage. Within days after Longstreet started his 10-day trek, Lee began a series of letters to Davis and Longstreet, urging that Longstreet be sent to clear Burnside out of Knoxville and then be promptly returned to Lee. Amazingly, Davis carried this suggestion to Bragg and Longstreet during a trip to Bragg's headquarters to resolve a dispute between Bragg and all his subordinate generals, including the borrowed Longstreet. Because Bragg and Longstreet wanted to be rid of each other, they agreed to Lee's proposal, and Longstreet and 15,000 troops were sent away from Chattanooga on November 5th. The Lee-generated departure of Longstreet played into the hands of Grant, who had been brought to Chattanooga to save the nearly besieged Army of the Cumberland. Grant arrived there on October 23rd, created a life-saving supply line within 5 days, and began gathering Union troops from around the country, including 2 corps from Lee's theater for a breakout from Chattanooga, while Grant thus built his forces up to perhaps 75,000. The Lee-inspired exodus of Longstreet's 15,000 troops simultaneously reduced rebel strength in the area to a mere 36,000. Thus, when Grant's troops successfully charged up Missionary Ridge, the spread-thin Confederates fled in considerable disarray into northern Georgia.
Grant's victory at Chattanooga, with the unintended assist from Lee, ended any semblance of rebel control in Tennessee and set the stage for Sherman's 1860 for Atlanta campaign. Having won the Mississippi Valley and saved the trapped Union Army in the Middle Theater, Grant was the obvious choice to be brought east and promoted to general-in-chief. His troops' total Western and Middle Theater casualties were 37,000, and they imposed 84,000 casualties on their opponents. He had won the West and was expected to win the East, the Middle Theater, and the war. With Sherman's help, he lived up to those expectations. In their well-known head-to-head confrontation in 1864–65, Grant achieved complete success in less than a year after launching his overland campaign on May 4, 1864, expected to produce results in time to aid Lincoln's critical bid for re-election in November 1864. Grant took his aggressiveness and persistence beyond the levels he had demonstrated in the Western and Middle theaters, but he also continued to demonstrate his dexterity and cunning. After bloody conflicts at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, the North Anna River, and Cold Harbor, Grant disengaged his entire army from Lee's without Lee's knowledge, sent it across the James River, and attacked Petersburg, the key to Richmond, before Lee could reinforce it. Because Grant's subordinates failed miserably, Petersburg held. Thus, Grant won the war in the East in 11 months instead of 2. While Grant and Lee fought in Virginia, Sherman advanced 3 armies toward Atlanta. Although Lee had succeeded in getting Longstreet's troops back to Virginia, the Union 11th and 12th Corps, which had been transferred from Virginia to Chattanooga as part of Grant's buildup there, remained in the Middle Theater as the new Army of the Ohio. Sherman's armies thus outnumbered Joseph Johnston's Army of Tennessee and continually moved around its flanks toward Atlanta. While all those armies were in the Atlanta environs, Davis, with Lee's blessing, replaced Johnston with John Bell Hood, one of the major mistakes of the war. A protege of Lee's, Hood wanted to attack whether or not circumstances justified attacking. Hood proceeded to go on the offensive, weaken his army, lose Atlanta, and virtually destroy his army in a quixotic foray into Tennessee late in 1864. The fall of Atlanta virtually ensured Lincoln's re-election, which doomed the Confederacy. Lee had facilitated Atlanta's fall by vouching for Hood's fighting capabilities and also by not reinforcing the outnumbered opponents of Sherman. Such an intertheater transfer was the worst nightmare of Grant and Sherman as they planned and executed their simultaneous 1864 campaigns. But Lee, first a Virginian and second a Confederate, never considered that option. Proof of its feasibility is that Lee sent Lieutenant General Jubal Early on a long-shot mission against Washington instead of proposing to send his 14,000 to 18,000 troops south to oppose Sherman and at least keep Union forces from capturing Atlanta before the crucial presidential election. Lee's failure to reinforce the Confederates in Georgia demonstrated that Lee was a one-theater general while Grant was a national general. Grant's performance outshone that of Lee. Grant, a national general, won the Mississippi Valley Theater, saved a trapped Union army in the Middle Theater, and won the Eastern Theater with fewer casualties than incurred there by his Union predecessors. The North had the burden of winning the war to end Southern independence, and Grant's aggressive actions were consistent with achieving victory. Grant won the war and was the greatest general of the war. On the other hand, Lee was a one-theater general who adversely influenced Confederate prospects in his own and other theaters. Although the South needed only a stalemate to maintain its independence and was badly outnumbered, Lee gambled for victory, initiated the disastrous Maryland and Gettysburg strategic campaigns, used overly aggressive tactics that decimated his army, and placed the Confederacy in a weakened condition that assured the re-election of Lincoln, whose defeat had become the South's best hope for victory. Finally, the respective casualty figures of these two generals contradict the myth about who, if either, was a butcher. For the entire war, Grant's soldiers incurred about 154,000 casualties killed, wounded, missing, captured, while imposing about 191,000 casualties on their foes. In all their battles, Lee's troops incurred about 209,000 casualties, while imposing about 240,000 casualties on their opponents. Thus, both generals' armies imposed about 40,000 more casualties than they incurred. However, Lee, who should have been fighting defensively and preserving his precious manpower, instead exceeded Grant's understandable aggressiveness and incurred 55,000 more casualties than Grant. In summary, Grant's aggressiveness in three theaters was consistent with the Union need for victory, and resulted in success at a militarily reasonable cost, while Lee's aggressiveness in a single theater was inconsistent with the strategic and tactical defensiveness the Confederates needed to preserve their limited manpower and force the stalemate that was sufficient for Southern victory. Edward Bone Kemper is the author of 4 books and many published articles on the Civil War. His articles have appeared in the Washington Times, the American Bar Association Journal, and the Journal of Afro-American History. Mr. Bone Kemper has lectured or served as an adjunct professor of history at Muhlenberg College, George Mason University, and the U.S. Coast Guard Academy, and has made over 250 appearances as a speaker on the Civil War to groups at the Smithsonian Institution, the NYC Military Affairs Symposium, the National Civil War Museum in Harrisburg, as well as to Civil War roundtables in California, Washington State, Connecticut, Florida, Illinois, and all the mid-Atlantic states from New York to Virginia. Mr. Bone Kemper is a graduate of Yale Law School and was awarded an M.A. in History by Old Dominion University, Norfolk, VA, and ABA in American History by Muhlenberg College, Allentown, PA. He worked as a U.S. government attorney for 34 years for the United States Coast Guard and the Department of Transportation and is now retired. He lives in Willow Street, PA. The Cleveland Civil War Roundtable hosts U.S. Grant in 160th anniversary celebration of Civil War's end with special week-long series across Northeast Ohio, Cleveland. On this May, Northeast Ohio will step back in time to experience a living history event like no other as General and President U.S. Grant, portrayed by acclaimed historian Dr. Kurt Fields, visits schools, libraries, and historical sites across the region to commemorate the 160th anniversary of the end of the U.S. Civil War, starting May 12, 2025. Dr. Fields will bring the remarkable story of U.S. Grant to 10 locations throughout Northeast Ohio as part of a week-long Cleveland campaign. Dr. Fields will appear at 5 local schools during the day and at 5 evening venues throughout the week. As the premier living historian who portrays Grant, Dr. Fields is renowned within the Civil War community. He will also portray Grant at the U.S. Park Service's 160th Appomattox anniversary event on April 9th. Dr. Fields has visited Cleveland before, speaking at the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable and other local Civil War groups to standing-room-only audiences. This visit is special because we are partnering with other organizations to help General Grant reach a broader audience beyond just Civil War enthusiasts, said Jean Claridge, president of the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable. We believe the Civil War era of 1850 to 1876 is one of the most pivotal periods in U.S. history, yet it remains poorly understood by many. U.S. Grant's role during this time, in particular, is often overlooked. Steve Pettyjohn, Roundtable director, added, U.S. Grant is one of the most misunderstood and underappreciated figures in American history. Only 3 individuals have held supreme command in war and gone on to serve 2 terms as president: George Washington, Dwight Eisenhower, and U.S. Grant. Grant, the commanding general of the Union Army, played a crucial role in winning the Civil War before serving 2 terms as president, navigating the challenges of Reconstruction and post-war America. Dr. Fields' presentations will focus on various aspects of Grant's life and career. His school presentations, titled Meet U.S. Grant, will offer an overview of his life and the many challenges he overcame. The Roundtable is particularly excited that Dr. Fields will speak to over 1,000 local students across 5 schools: Lutheran West in Rocky River, Langston Middle School in Oberlin, Lee Burnison Middle School in Westlake, Strongsville Middle School, and Fremont Middle School. These school appearances are co-sponsored by the Roundtable and various local organizations, including the Westlake Bay Village Rotary, Oberlin History Center, and the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Center. The evening programs will focus on more specific aspects of Grant's legacy. On Monday, May 12th, Dr. Fields will present General Grant's Appomattox campaign at Westlake Porter Library at 7 p.m. He will repeat the program at the main branch of the Lorain County Library on Tuesday. May 13th at 6 p.m. Dr. Fields will appear again at the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable meeting on Wednesday. May 14th at 6:30 p.m. Holiday Inn, Independence, to discuss the chaotic period following Appomattox and the assassination of President Lincoln. On Thursday, May 15th, General Grant will appear at the Western Reserve Historical Society's Cleveland History Center for an evening with U.S. Grant at 6:30 p.m., where attendees can learn highlights of his career and ask questions. Finally, on Friday, May 16th, President Grant will visit the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Museum and Library at Spiegel Grove in Fremont, Ohio, at 6 p.m. to discuss his challenging presidency and engage in a discussion with President Hayes portrayed by local historian Paula DeMaria. These evening events are co-sponsored by the Cleveland Civil War Roundtable, Porter and Lorain Libraries, the Western Reserve Historical Society Cleveland History Center, and the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museum. The Overland Campaign, also known as Grant's Overland Campaign and the Wilderness Campaign, was a series of battles fought in Virginia during May and June 1864. Towards the end of the American Civil War, Lt. Gen. Ulysses S. Grant, General-in-Chief of all Union armies, directed the actions of the Army of the Potomac, commanded by Major Gen. George G. Meade, and other forces against Confederate Gen. Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Although Grant suffered severe losses during the campaign, it was a strategic Union victory. It inflicted proportionately higher losses on Lee's army and maneuvered it into a siege at Richmond and Petersburg, Virginia, in just over 8 weeks, crossing the Rapidan River on May 4, 1864. Grant sought to defeat Lee's army by quickly placing his forces between Lee and Richmond and inviting an open battle. Lee surprised Grant by attacking the larger Union army in the Battle of the Wilderness May 5th to 7th, resulting in many casualties on both sides. Unlike his predecessors in the Eastern Theater, Grant did not withdraw his army following this setback but instead maneuvered to the southeast, resuming his attempt to interpose his forces between Lee and Richmond. Lee's army was able to get into position to block this maneuver. At the Battle of Spotsylvania Courthouse May 8th to 21st, Grant repeatedly attacked segments of the Confederate defensive line, hoping for a breakthrough, but the only results were again many losses for both sides. Grant maneuvered again, meeting Lee at the North Anna River Battle of North Anna May 23rd to 26th. Here, Lee held clever defensive positions to divide the Union army and attack them. However, the effectiveness of the plan is debatable. The final major battle of the campaign was waged at Cold Harbor May 31st, June 12th, in which Grant gambled that Lee's army was exhausted and ordered a massive assault against strong defensive positions, resulting in disproportionately heavy Union casualties. Resorting to maneuver a final time, Grant surprised Lee by stealthily crossing the James River, threatening to capture the city of Petersburg, the loss of which would doom the Confederate capital. The resulting siege of Petersburg, June 1864, April 1865, led to the eventual surrender of Lee's army in April 1865 and the end of the Civil War. The campaign included long-range raids by Union cavalry under Major Gen. Philip Sheridan. In a raid toward Richmond, Confederate cavalry commander Major Gen. J.B. Stuart was mortally wounded at the Battle of Yellow Tavern May 11th. In a raid attempting to destroy the Virginia Central Railroad to the west, Sheridan was thwarted by Major Gen. Wade Hampton at the Battle of Trevilian Station June 11th to 12th. The largest cavalry battle of the war, military situation in March 1864. Grant was summoned from the Western Theater, promoted to lieutenant general, and given command of all Union armies. He chose to make his headquarters with the Army of the Potomac, although Meade retained formal command of that army. Major Gen. William Tecumseh Sherman succeeded Grant in command of most of the Western armies. Grant and President Abraham Lincoln devised a coordinated strategy that would strike at the heart of the Confederacy from multiple directions. Grant, Meade, and Benjamin Butler against Lee near Richmond, Virginia. Franz Sigel in the Shenandoah Valley. Sherman to invade Georgia, defeat Joseph E. Johnston, and capture Atlanta. George Crook and William W. Averill to operate against railroad supply lines in West Virginia, and Nathaniel Banks to capture Mobile, Alabama. This was the first time the Union armies would have a coordinated offensive strategy across a number of theaters. Although previous Union campaigns in Virginia targeted the Confederate capital of Richmond as their primary objective, this time the goal was to capture Richmond by aiming for the destruction of Lee's army. Lincoln had long advocated this strategy for his generals, recognizing that the city would certainly fall after the loss of its principal defensive army. Grant ordered Meade, "Wherever Lee goes, there you will go also." Although he hoped for a quick, decisive battle, Grant was prepared to fight a war of attrition. He meant to hammer continuously against the armed force of the enemy and his resources until by mere attrition, if in no other way, there should be nothing left to him but an equal submission with the loyal section of our common country to the Constitution and laws of the land. Both Union and Confederate casualties could be high, but the Union had greater resources to replace lost soldiers and equipment. Opposing force despite Grant's superior numbers, he had manpower challenges. Following their severe beating at the Battle of Gettysburg the previous year, though the First Corps and the Third Corps had been disbanded and their survivors reallocated to other corps, which damaged unit cohesion and morale. Because he was operating on the offensive in enemy territory, Grant had to defend his bases of supply and the lines extending from them to his army in the field. It was principally for this reason that Grant chose to maneuver repeatedly around Lee's right flank during the campaign, relying on waterborne supply lines instead of the railroads, such as the Orange and Alexandria in Virginia's interior. Furthermore, since many of his soldiers' 3-year enlistments were about to expire, they were naturally reluctant to participate in dangerous assaults. To deal with these challenges, Grant supplemented his forces by reassigning soldiers manning the heavy artillery batteries around Washington, D.C. to infantry regiments, battles Wilderness May 5th to 7th. 1864, the Overland Campaign began as Grant's forces crossed the Rapidan River on May 4, 1864. Grant's objective was to force an engagement with Lee outside of his mine-run fortifications by either drawing his forces out or turning them. Lee, displaying the audacity that characterized his generalship, moved out as Grant desired, but more quickly than Grant anticipated. Union forces had insufficient time to clear the area known as the Wilderness, a tangle of scrub brush and undergrowth in which part of the Battle of Chancellorsville had been fought the previous year. By forcing a fight here, Lee effectively neutralized the Union's advantage in artillery. He ordered Ewell's corps to advance on the Orange Turnpike, A.P. Hill's and parallel on the Orange Plank Road, and James Longstreet's from the distant Gordonsville. Early on May 5th, Warren's the 5th Corps was advancing south toward the Plank Road when Ewell's corps appeared in the west on the turnpike. Meade halted his army and directed Warren to attack if the Confederates were a small, isolated group. Ewell's men erected earthworks on the western end of the clearing known as Saunders Field. Warren requested a delay from Meade so that Sedgwick's the 6th Corps could be brought in on his right and extend his line. By 1 p.m., Meade was frustrated by the delay and ordered Warren to attack before Sedgwick could arrive. The brigade of Brig. Gen. Ramaimbieres had to take cover in a gully to avoid enfilading fire. The brigade of Brig. Gen. Joseph J. Bartlett made better progress to Ayres's left and overran the position of Brig. Gen. John M. Jones, who was killed. However, since Ayres's men were unable to advance, Bartlett's right flank was now exposed to attack, and his brigade was forced to flee back across the clearing dot to the left of Bartlett. The Iron Brigade, commanded by Brig. Gen. Lysander Cutler, struck a brigade of Alabamians commanded by Brig. Gen. Cullen A. Battle, although initially pushed back. The Confederates counterattacked with the brigade of Brig. Gen. John B. Gordon, tearing through the line and forcing the Iron Brigade to flee. Near the Higgerson Farm, the brigades of Call, Roy Stone, and Brig. Gen. James C. Rice attacked the brigades of Brig. Gen. George P. Doles's Georgians and Brig. Gen. Junius Daniels' North Carolinians. Both attacks failed under heavy fire, and Crawford ordered his men to pull back. Warren ordered an artillery section into Saunders Field to support his attack, but it was captured by Confederate soldiers, who were pinned down and prevented by rifle fire from moving the guns until darkness. In the midst of hand-to-hand combat at the guns, the field caught fire and men from both sides were shocked as their wounded comrades burned to death. The lead elements of Sedgwick's the 6th Corps reached Saunders Field at 3 p.m., by which time Warren's men had ceased fighting. Sedgwick attacked Ewell's line in the woods north of the turnpike, and both sides traded attacks and counterattacks that lasted about an hour before each disengaged to erect earthworks. A.P. Hill's approach on the plank road that afternoon was detected, and Meade ordered the 6th Corps Division of Brig. Gen. George W. Getty to defend the important intersection with the Brock Road. Getty's men arrived just before Hill's, and the two forces skirmished briefly, ending with Hill's men withdrawing a few hundred yards west of the intersection. Meade sent orders to Hancock directing him to move the 2nd Corps north to come to Getty's assistance. As the Union men approached the position of Major Gen. Henry Hett, they were pinned down by fire from a shallow ridge to their front. As each the 2nd Corps Division arrived, Hancock sent it forward to assist, bringing enough combat power to bear that Lee was forced to commit his reserves. The division commanded by Major Gen. Cadmus M. Wilcox, fierce fighting continued until nightfall with neither side gaining an advantage. On May 6th, Hancock's the 2nd Corps attacked Hill at 5 a.m., overwhelming the 3rd Corps with the divisions of Wadsworth, Birney, and Mott. Getty and Gibbon were in support. Lee had assured Hill that Longstreet's corps would arrive to reinforce Hill before dawn, but moving cross-country in the dark, they made slow progress and lost their way at times. Ewell's men on the turnpike had attacked first at 4:45 a.m., but continued to be pinned down by attacks from Sedgwick's and Warren's corps and could not be relied upon for assistance. Before a total collapse, however, reinforcements arrived at 6 a.m. Brig. Gen. John Gregg's 800-man Texas Brigade, the vanguard of Longstreet's column. General Lee, caught up in the excitement, began to move forward with the advancing brigade. As the Texans realized this, they halted, refusing to move forward. Unless Lee remained in the rear, Longstreet counterattacked, with the divisions of Major Gen. Charles W. Field and Brig. Gen. Joseph B. Kershaw. The Union troops fell a few hundred yards back from the Widow Tap Farm. At 10 a.m., Longstreet's chief engineer reported that he had explored an unfinished railroad bed south of the Plank Road and that it offered easy access to the Union left flank. Longstreet's aide, L.T. Call Moxley Sorrell, and the senior brigade commander, Brig. Gen. William Mahin, struck at 11 a.m. with 4 brigades. At the same time, Longstreet resumed his main attack, driving Hancock's men back to the Brock Road. But the momentum was lost when Longstreet was wounded by his own men, putting him out of action until October at the turnpike. Inconclusive fighting continued for most of the day. Early in the morning, Brig. Gen. John B. Gordon scouted the Union line and recommended to his division commander, Jubal Early, that he conduct a flanking attack. But Early dismissed the venture as too risky and did not approve it until that evening. Gordon's attack made good progress against inexperienced New York troops, but eventually the darkness and the dense foliage took their toll as the Union flank received reinforcements and recovered on the morning of May 7th. Grant chose maneuver instead of further attacks. By moving south on the Brock Road, he hoped to reach the crossroads at Spotsylvania Courthouse, which would interpose his army between Lee and Richmond. forcing Lee to fight on ground more advantageous to the Union Army. He ordered preparations for a night march on May 7th that would reach Spotsylvania, 10 miles 16 kilometers to the southeast, by the morning of May 8th. Unfortunately for Grant, inadequate cavalry screening allowed Lee's army to reach the crossroads before sufficient Union troops arrived to contest it. Spotsylvania Courthouse, May 8th to 21st at dawn on May 8th. Fitzhugh Lee's cavalrymen staked out a defensive line on a low ridge that they dubbed Laurel Hill. Reinforcements from Anderson arrived just as Warren's men pulled up within 100 yards to the north. Assuming only cavalry blocked his path, Warren ordered an immediate attack. Multiple attacks by the divisions of the 5th Corps were repulsed with heavy casualties. In the afternoon, Sedgwick's the 6th Corps arrived near Laurel Hill and extended Warren's line to the east. By 7 p.m., both corps began a coordinated assault but were repulsed by heavy fire. They attempted to move around Anderson's right flank, but were surprised to find that divisions from Ewell's 2nd Corps had arrived in that sector to repulse them again. Generals Meade and Sheridan had quarreled about the cavalry's performance throughout the campaign and their failures. May 7th to 8th brought Meade's notorious temper to a boil. Sheridan told Meade that he could whip Stuart if Meade let him. Meade reported the conversation to Grant, who replied, "Well, he generally knows what he is talking about. Let him start right out and do it." Meade deferred to Grant's judgment and issued orders to Sheridan to proceed against the enemies. Cavalry, Sheridan's entire command of 10,000 cavalrymen departed the following day. They engaged with and mortally wounded Stuart at the Battle of Yellow Tavern on May 11th, threatened the outskirts of Richmond, refitted near the James River, and did not return to the army until May 24th. Grant and Meade were left without cavalry resources during the critical days of the battle to come. Over the night of May 8th to 9th, the Confederates erected a series of earthworks more than 4 miles 6.4 kilometers long, highlighted by an exposed salient known as the Mule Shoe extending more than a mile 1.6 kilometers in front of the main trench line. At about 9 a.m., Major John Sedgwick was inspecting the 6th Corps line when he was shot through the head by a Confederate sharpshooter's bullet, dying instantly. He was replaced by Major Horatio G. Wright. Grant ordered Hancock to cross the Po River and attack the Confederates' left flank, driving them back toward Burnside's position near the Ni River, while the rest of his command, in the center, watched for an opening to attack there as well. Hancock's the 2nd Corps advanced across the Po, but he delayed his attack until the morning. This error was fatal to Grant's plan. That night, Lee moved to divisions of Jubal Early's corps from Spotsylvania Courthouse into position against Hancock. On the morning of May 10th, Grant ordered Hancock to withdraw north of the Po, leaving a single division in place to occupy the Confederates in that sector, while the rest of his army was to attack at 5 p.m. across the entire Confederate line. At 2 p.m., Jubal Early decided to attack the division, which retreated across the Po without being captured, destroying the bridges behind them while Hancock was in the Po sector. Warren requested permission from Meade to attack Laurel Hill at 4 p.m., uncoordinated with the rest of Grant's attack. Again, the Laurel Hill line repulsed the Union troops with heavy losses. Grant was forced to postpone his 5 p.m. coordinated assault until Warren could get his troops reformed. Not informed of the delay, Brig. Gen. Gershom Mott of the 2nd Corps moved his division forward at 5 p.m. toward the tip of the Mule Shoe. When his men reached the open field, Confederate artillery ripped them to shreds and they retreated. At around 6 p.m., Emory Upton led a group of 12 hand-picked regiments, about 5,000 men in for battle lines, against an identified weak point on the west side of the Mule Shoe. The plan was for Upton's men to rush across the open field without pausing to fire and reload, reaching the earthworks before the Confederates could fire more than a couple of shots. The plan worked well initially, but Generals Lee and Ewell were quick to organize a vigorous counterattack with brigades from all sectors of the Mule Shoe. No Union supporting units arrived. Upton's men were driven out of the Confederate works, and he reluctantly ordered them to retreat despite his reverses on May 10th. Grant had reason for optimism because of the partial success of Upton's innovative assault. He planned to use the same tactics with Hancock's entire corps. On the Confederate side, Lee received some intelligence reports that made him believe Grant was planning to withdraw toward Fredericksburg. If this happened, he wanted to follow up with an immediate attack. Concerned about the mobility of his artillery to support the potential attack, he ordered that the guns be withdrawn from Allegheny Johnson's division in the Muleshoe to be ready for a movement to the right. He was completely unaware, of course, that this was exactly the place Grant intended to attack. Johnson requested to Ewell that his artillery be returned, but somehow the order did not reach the artillery units until 3:30 a.m. on May 12, 30 minutes before Hancock's assault was planned to start. Hancock's assault started at 4:35 a.m. on May 12 and easily crashed through the Confederate works. Despite the initial success at obliterating much of the Muleshoe salient, there was a flaw in the Union plan. No one had considered how to capitalize on the breakthrough. The 15,000 infantrymen of Hancock's Second Corps had crowded into a narrow front about a half-mile wide and soon lost all unit cohesion, becoming little more than an armed mob. Following the initial shock, the Confederate leadership at all levels began to react well to the Union onslaught, and reinforcements were rushed in to stem the tide. As Hancock bogged down, Grant sent in reinforcements, ordering both Wright and Warren to move forward. The 6th Corps Division of Brig. Gen. Thomas H. Neal headed for the western leg of the Muleshoe, at the point where it turned to the south. This sector of the line, where the heaviest fighting of the day would occur, became known as the Bloody Angle. Heavy rain began to fall, and both sides fought on the earthworks slippery with both water and blood. The opposing troops' gunpowder became wet and unusable, forcing them into a massive close quarters, hand-to-hand struggle similar to ancient battles. Warren's attack at Laurel Hill began on a small scale around 8:15 a.m. for some of his men. This was their 4th or 5th attack against the same objective, and few fought with enthusiasm. They were repulsed again. Burnside advanced against the eastern leg of the Muleshoe before dawn, materially aiding Hancock's breakthrough. At 2 p.m., Grant and Lee coincidentally ordered simultaneous attacks in this stalemated sector. The advance by Union Brig. Gen. Orlando B. Wilcox's division was stopped as Brig. Gen. James H. Lane's brigade moved forward and hit them in the flank. Throughout the afternoon, Confederate engineers scrambled to create a new defensive line 500 yards further south at the base of the Muleshoe, while fighting at the Bloody Angle continued day and night with neither side achieving an advantage. At 4 a.m. on May 13th, the exhausted Confederate infantrymen were notified that the new line was ready, and they withdrew from the original earthworks unit by unit. The combat they had endured for almost 24 hours was characterized by an intensity of firepower never previously seen in Civil War battles. As the entire landscape was flattened, all the foliage destroyed. May 12th was the most intensive day of fighting during the battle, with Union casualties of about 9,000, Confederate 8,000. The Confederate loss includes about 3,000 prisoners captured in the Muleshoe. Despite the significant casualties of May 12th, Grant was undeterred. He planned to reorient his lines and shift the center of potential action to the east of Spotsylvania, where he could renew the battle. He ordered the 5th and the 6th Corps to move behind the 2nd Corps and take positions past the left flank of the 9th Corps. On the night of May 13th to 14th, the Corps began a difficult march in heavy rain. Grant notified Washington that, having endured 5 days of almost continuous rain, his army could not resume offensive operations until they had 24 hours of dry weather. The weather finally cleared on May 17th. Grant ordered the 2nd Corps and the 6th Corps to attack against the Muleshoe area again at sunrise. May 18th, unfortunately for the Union plan, the former Confederate works were still occupied by Ewell's 2nd Corps, and they had used the intervening time to improve the earthworks and the obstacles laid out in front of them. Unlike on May 12th, they were not caught by surprise. As Hancock's men advanced, they were caught up in amity and subjected to artillery fire so devastating that infantry rifle fire was not necessary to repulse the attack. Wright and Burnside had no better luck in supporting attacks. Grant decided to abandon the Spotsylvania area. He ordered Hancock's the 2nd Corps to march to the railroad line between Fredericksburg and Richmond and then turn south. With luck, Lee might take the bait and follow, seeking to overwhelm and destroy the isolated corps. In that case, Grant would chase Lee with his remaining corps and strike him before the Confederates could entrench again. Before Hancock began to move, Lee ordered Ewell to conduct a reconnaissance and force to locate the northern flank of the Union Army. Ewell fought near the Harris Farm with several units of Union heavy artillery soldiers who had recently been converted to infantry. Duty before he was recalled by Lee, Grant's intended advance of Hancock's corps was delayed by the Harris Farm engagement, so the troops did not begin their movement south until the night of May 20th to 21st. Lee did not fall into Grant's trap of attacking Hancock, but traveled on a parallel path to the north and a river, Yellow Tavern, May 11th. For the early days of the campaign, the Wilderness and the approach to Spotsylvania Courthouse Meade had employed Sheridan's cavalry corps primarily in the traditional role of screening and reconnaissance, whereas Sheridan saw the value of wielding his force as an independently operating offensive weapon for wide-ranging raids into the rear areas of the enemy. On May 8th, Sheridan told Meade that if his command were freed to operate as an independent unit, he could defeat Yep Stuart. Grant was intrigued and convinced Meade of the value of Sheridan's request. On May 9th, over 10,000 of Sheridan's troopers rode to the southeast with 32 artillery pieces to move behind Lee's army. The column, which at times stretched for over 13 miles 21 kilometers, reached the Confederate forward supply base at Beaver Dam Station that evening. Sheridan's men destroyed numerous railroad cars and 6 locomotives of the Virginia Central Railroad, destroyed telegraph wires, and rescued almost 400 Union soldiers who had been captured in the Wilderness. Stuart moved his 4,500 troopers to get between Sheridan and Richmond. The two forces met at noon on May 11th at Yellow Tavern and abandoned and located 6 miles 9.7 kilometers north of Richmond. Not only did the Union outnumber the Confederates by 3 divisions to 2 brigades, it had superior firepower. All were armed with rapid-firing Spencer carbines. The Confederate troopers tenaciously resisted from the low ridge line bordering the road to Richmond, fighting for over 3 hours. A countercharge by the 1st Virginia Cavalry pushed the advancing Union troopers back from the hilltop as Stuart, mounted on horseback, shouted encouragement. As the 5th Michigan Cavalry streamed in retreat past Stuart, he was shot and he died in Richmond the following day. The fighting kept up for an hour after Stuart was wounded. Major Gen. Fitzhugh taking temporary command. Meadow Bridge, May 12th, after Yellow Tavern. Sheridan led his troops southward towards Richmond on May 11th, carefully feeling his way through the abandoned outer defensive works. He kept up his movement down the brook pike, not realizing that he was boxing himself into a potential trap. Sheridan found himself only 2.5 miles from his objective, but saw that the intermediate defenses in his front swarmed with enemy troops. His left flank was against the swollen Chickahominy, and Confederate cavalry threatened his rear. Hoping to capture the Union force, Sheridan decided to force a crossing of the river at Meadow Bridge, where the Virginia Central Railroad crossed the river. He assigned the Michigan Brigade of Brig. Gen. George A. Custer, part of Brig. Gen. Wesley Merritt's division, to seize the span and the high bluffs beyond. The rest of Sheridan's command had to hold the Confederates at bay while Custer executed his orders. The rearguard of Brig. Gen. David M.C.M. Gregg's division was assailed on 3 sides when it was light enough for a brigade of Confederate infantry to sally forth from the fortifications and attack. Soon, other Confederates, including Richmond's citizens hastily pressed into military service, joined in the efforts to break through the rear lines. James H. Wilson's men were initially pushed back in some confusion, but Gregg had concealed a heavy line of skirmishers armed with repeating carbines in a brushy ravine. His men poured forth a destructive fire, halting the final Confederate advances, assisted by some of Wilson's men who turned the flank of the attacking column. Federal horse artillery made sure that the Confederate infantry no longer was a threat, and 3 mounted cavalry regiments skirmished with approaching enemy cavalry, turning them aside and protecting the rear. In the meantime, Custer's 5th Michigan Cavalry used snipers to suppress Confederate rifle fire while several daring dismounted troopers crossed the damaged railroad bridge, hopping from railroad tie to tie while menaced by persistent enemy artillery fire. Followed by the 6th Michigan, they succeeded in the early afternoon in clearing the north bank of the Chickahominy and gaining a foothold on the Confederate side of the river. Custer's men pinned down remaining threatening enemy units and captured 2 artillery pieces, while pioneers energetically planked the bridge to provide safe passage for large numbers of men and horses. By mid-afternoon, Merritt's entire division had crossed and engaged the Confederate hasty works on Richmond Heights, driving the defenders back to Gaines's Mill by 4 p.m. The rest of Sheridan's cavalry had crossed the river. Sheridan destroyed the Virginia Central Bridge in his wake to prevent further pursuit. After his men had rested, Sheridan brushed aside the remaining Confederate resistance in the area and marched his column to Mechanicsville. They bivouacked that night at Gaines's Mill, which was burned the following morning by some of the stragglers. Sheridan ordered a bucket brigade to douse the flames. Upon reaching Bottom's Bridge over the Chickahominy, they found it had also been damaged and rested there for the night while it was repaired. By this time, Sheridan's men were suffering from hunger, and it was becoming urgent that they reach Union lines. On May 14th, he led his men to Haxall's Landing on the James River, linking up with Major Gen. Benjamin Butler's force, ending his raid. After resupplying with Butler, Sheridan's men returned to join Grant at Chesterfield Station on May 24th. Sheridan's raid was an overall tactical success, having killed Yep Stewart at Yellow Tavern and beaten Fitzhugh Lee at Meadow Bridge, all with relatively minimal casualties, about 625 men for the entire raid compared to 800 Confederate. From a strategic standpoint, however, the raid deprived General Grant of the cavalry resources that would have been helpful at Spotsylvania Courthouse and his subsequent advance to the north and a river, and there are lingering questions about whether Sheridan should have attempted to assault the city of Richmond. In the latter case, Sheridan believed it would not have been worth the risk in casualties, and he recognized that the chances of holding the city for more than a brief time would be minimal. Any advantages would primarily result from damage to Confederate morale north and May 23rd to 26th as the armies started their movements from Spotsylvania. The odds between them had become closer. Grant's army totaled approximately 68,000 men, depleted from the start of the campaign by battle losses, illnesses, and expired enlistments. Lee's was about 53,044 for the first time in the campaign. He received sizable reinforcements, including 3 of the 4 brigades in Major Gen. George E. Pickett's division, about 6,000 men from the James River defenses, and 2 brigades to 500 men of Major Gen. John C. Breckinridge's command from the Shenandoah Valley. Grant's objective following Spotsylvania was the north and a river, about 25 miles 40 kilometers south, and the important railroad intersection just south of it, Hanover Junction. Grant knew that Lee could probably beat him in a straight race to the North Anna, so he devised a stratagem that might be a successful alternative. He designated Hancock's the 2nd Corps to head southeast from Spotsylvania to Milford Station, hoping that Lee would take the bait and attack this isolated corps. If he did, Grant would attack him with his 3 remaining corps. If he did not, Grant would have lost nothing, and his advance element might reach the North Anna before Lee could. Hancock's corps of 20,000 men started marching the night of May 2021. He was surprised to encounter some of Pickett's men at Milford Station on May 21st, from which he inferred correctly that Lee was being reinforced. Rather than risk his corps in a fight in an isolated location, he decided to terminate his maneuver. Lee was still in the dark about Grant's intentions and was reluctant to disengage prematurely from the Spotsylvania courthouse line. He cautiously extended Ewell's corps to the Telegraph Road and notified Breckinridge, who was en route to join Lee, to stop at Hanover Junction and defend the North Anna River line until Lee could join him. Meanwhile, Grant started the rest of his corps on their marches. Lee ordered Ewell to march south on the Telegraph Road, followed by Anderson's corps and A.P. Hill's corps on parallel roads to the west. Lee's orders were not urgent. He knew that Ewell had 25 miles, 40 kilometers to march over relatively good roads, versus Hancock's 34 miles, 55 kilometers over inferior roads on the morning of May 23rd. Warren and Hancock approached the North Anna. There were no significant fortifications to their front. Lee had misjudged Grant's plan, assuming any advance against the North Anna would be a mere diversion, while the main body of Grant's army continued its flanking march to the east. At the Chesterfield Bridge crossing the Telegraph Road, a small South Carolina brigade under Call, John W. Hennagan had created a dirt redoubt, and there was a small party guarding the railroad bridge downstream. But all the other river crossings were left undefended. Grant had been presented with a golden opportunity if he moved quickly enough to take advantage of it. Hancock's men, led by the division of Major Gen. David B. Birney, overwhelmed Hannigan's small force, which fled across the bridge. Union sharpshooters discouraged Confederate attempts to burn the bridge. Hancock's men did not cross the bridge and seize ground to the south because Confederate artillery was laying down heavy fire against them. At Jericho Mills, Warren found the river ford unprotected and established a beachhead south of the river. General Lee convinced his Third Corps commander, A.P. Hill, that Warren's movement was simply a feint. So Hill sent only a single division, commanded by Major Gen. Cadmus M. Wilcox, to deal with Warren's supposedly minor threat. The Union troops were taken by surprise and their right flank was beaten back, but they were supported by 3 batteries of artillery, which slowed the Confederate advance until Union reinforcements arrived to end the brief battle. The next morning, Lee expressed his displeasure at Hill's performance. "General Hill, why did you let those people cross here? Why didn't you throw your whole force on them and drive them back as Jackson would have done?" By the evening of May 23rd, Lee finally understood that a major battle was developing in this location and began to plan his defensive position. He and his chief engineer devised a solution, a 5-mile, 8 kilometers line that formed an inverted V shape with its apex on the river at Oxford, the only defensible crossing in the area. On the western line of the V, reaching southwest to anchor on Little River, was the corps of A.P. Hill. On the east were Anderson and Ewell, extending through Hanover Junction and ending behind a swamp. Lee's men worked non-stop overnight to complete the fortifications. The new position represented a significant potential threat to Grant by moving south of the river. Lee hoped that Grant would assume that he was retreating, leaving only a token force to prevent a crossing at Oxford if Grant pursued. Then Lee hoped the pointed wedge of the inverted V would split Grant's army and Lee could concentrate on interior lines to defeat one wing. The other Union wing would have to cross the North Anna twice to support the attacked wing. On the morning of May 24th, Hancock's the Second Corps crossed the Chesterfield Bridge with Major Gen. John Gibbon's division in the lead. Grant had begun to fall into Lee's trap. Seeing the ease of crossing the river, he assumed the Confederates were retreating. He wired to Washington, "The enemy have fallen back from North Anna. We are in pursuit." The only visible opposition to the Union crossing was at Oxford, which Grant interpreted to be a rearguard action, and ordered Burnside's the 9th Corps to deal with it. Burnside's division under Brig. Gen. Samuel W. Crawford marched downriver to Quarles Mill and seized the ford there. Burnside ordered Major Gen. Thomas L. Crittenden's division to cross over at the ford and follow the river's southern bank to Oxford and attack the Confederate position from the west. Crittenden's lead brigade was under Brig. Gen. James H. Ledlie, who was known for excessive drinking of alcohol in the field. Intoxicated and ambitious, Ledlie decided to attack the Confederate position with his brigade alone, encountering the Confederate earthworks manned by Brig. Gen. William Mahin's division. Ledlie's men were immediately repulsed. Crittenden sent word to Ledlie not to attack until the full division had crossed the river, but Ledlie, by now completely drunk, ordered a charge. The Confederates waited to open fire until they were at close range, and the effect was to drive Ledlie's leading men into ditches for protection. To Massachusetts regiments rallied, but Mahin's Mississippi troops stepped out of their works and shot them down. Despite his miserable performance, Ledlie received praise from his division commander that his brigade behaved gallantly. He was promoted to division command after the battle, and his drunkenness in the field continued to plague his men, culminating in his humiliating failure at the Battle of the Crater in July, after which he was relieved of command, never to receive another assignment. Hancock's the Second Corps began pushing south from Chesterfield Bridge at about the same time that Ledlie was initially crossing the river, but the combined divisions of Major Gens John Gibbon and David B. Birney could not break the Confederate line. Although the Union Army had done precisely what Lee had hoped it would do, Lee's plan came to naught. The morning of the river crossing, Lee suddenly suffered a debilitating attack of diarrhea and was forced to remain in his tent bedridden. Unfortunately, he had not sufficiently empowered a subordinate commander to take over during his illness. Lee lamented in his tent, "We must strike them a blow, we must never let them pass again, we must strike them a blow," but Lee lacked the means to execute his plan. Grant identified the situation he faced with a divided army and ordered his men to stop advancing and to build earthworks of their own. A significant command change occurred on the evening of May 24. Grant and Meade had had numerous quarrels during the campaign about strategy and tactics, and tempers were reaching the boiling point. Grant mollified Meade somewhat by ordering that Major Gen. Ambrose Burnside and the Ninth Corps would henceforth report to Meade's Army of the Potomac, rather than to Grant directly. Although Burnside was a more senior major general than Meade, he accepted the new subordinate position without protest. On May 25th, light skirmishing occurred between the lines, and Union soldiers occupied themselves by tearing up 5 miles of the Virginia Central Railroad, a key supply line from the Shenandoah Valley to Richmond. Grant's options were limited. The slaughter at Spotsylvania Courthouse ruled out the option of frontal attacks against the Confederate line, and getting around either Confederate flank was infeasible. However, the Union general remained optimistic. He was convinced that Lee had demonstrated the weakness of his army by not attacking when he had the upper hand. He wrote to the Army's Chief of Staff, Major Gen. Henry W. Halleck, "Lee's army is really whipped... I may be mistaken, but I feel that our success over Lee's army is already assured." Wilson's Wharf, May 24th. One of a series of protective outposts guarding supply lines for Union Major Gen. Benjamin Butler's Bermuda 100 campaign was a fort at Wilson's Wharf, at a strategic bend in the James River in eastern Charles City, overlooked by high bluffs. Its garrison of predominantly United States colored troops under Brig. Gen. Edward I. Wild had a frightening reputation among Southerners. His soldiers freed and recruited slaves, and in one case whipped a plantation owner who had a reputation for harshness to his slaves. The Richmond newspapers denounced these activities and put intense pressure on the government of Jefferson Davis to put a stop to Wild's depredations. Fitzhugh Lee's cavalry division was ordered to break up this nest and stop their uncivilized proceedings. Lee took 2,500 men and 1 cannon on a 40-mile march from Atlee's Station to reach Wilson's Wharf. At 1:30 p.m. on May 24th, Lee demanded the surrender of the garrison. He promised that the black soldiers would be taken to Richmond and treated as prisoners of war, but if they did not surrender, he would not be answerable for the consequences. Wild and his men interpreted This to mean that some of the men would be returned to their former masters and others would be tried by state authorities for inciting insurrection. Wild sent back a written reply that said, "We will try it," and told the 2 officers sent by Lee, "Take the fort if you can." Brig. Gen. William C. Wickham's Confederate Brigade moved east of the fort, while Col. John Donovan of the 5th South Carolina Cavalry demonstrated on the western end of the fort. Donovan's men advanced as far as the ditch and Abbey, but were driven back by heavy fire. Wickham's men rushed forward across an open field and were met by interlocking fields of musket fire, canister rounds from 10-pound Parrott rifles, and naval gunfire from the gunboat USS Don. Lee ordered his men to withdraw to Charles City Courthouse, and the next morning they rode back to Atlee's Station. Casualties were relatively light, and the action had little effect on the outcome of the war. But the North scored a propaganda victory. It was the first significant combat encounter between the Army of Northern Virginia and black soldiers who had fought well in a defensive battle against a larger attacking force. Southerners, unwilling to acknowledge their defeat against a predominantly African-American force, claimed that 6 gunboats and substantial numbers of white Union soldiers were involved in the action across the Pamunkey May 27th to 29th, as he did after the Wilderness and Spotsylvania. Grant now planned to leave the North Anna in another wide swing around Lee's flank, marching east of the Pamunkey River to screen his movements from the Confederates. He ordered on May 22nd that his supply depots at Belle Plaine, Aquia Landing, and Fredericksburg be moved to a new base at Port Royal, Virginia. On the Rappahannock River, 6 days later, the supply base was moved again, from Port Royal to White House on the Pamunkey. If Grant had decided to move directly south, he would have been forced to cross 3 rivers: the Little River, the Newfound, and the South Anna, minor obstacles that Lee would have to navigate instead before he could move. However, Grant was faced with the problem of disengaging from Lee's army. Not only were the armies closely situated, Grant first had to withdraw north over the North Anna, during which it would be very vulnerable to attack. Grant decided on a series of deceptive measures to disguise his intentions. On May 26th, he sent a cavalry division under Brig. Gen. James H. Wilson to Little River, probing the western end of the Confederate line, while at the same time men from the cavalry divisions of Brig. Gens. Alfred T. A. Torbert and David M. C. M. Gregg were sent to the Little Page Bridge and Taylor's Ford on the Pamunkey, 10 miles upriver from Grant's intended crossing points. Lee, who was still in his tent suffering from the diarrhea that had incapacitated him during the North Anna battle, was fooled by Grant's actions and assumed that the Union general would be moving west for the first time in the campaign. The Union infantry withdrew stealthily after dark on May 26th, and by the morning of May 27th all were safely north of the North Anna. Burnside's the 9th Corps and Hancock's the 2nd Corps stayed in place to guard the river crossings, while Warren's the 5th Corps and Wright's the 6th Corps, led by Sheridan's cavalry, began their march toward crossings near Hanover Town, about 34 miles to the southeast. Once Lee recognized that his opponent had departed, he moved his army swiftly in response. His 3 corps marched south along the Richmond, Fredericksburg, and Potomac Railroad and then overland, heading for Atlee's Station on the Virginia Central Railroad, a point only 9 miles north of Richmond. There, his men would be well positioned behind a stream known as Totopotomoy Creek to defend against Grant if he moved against the railroads or Richmond. He also sent a small brigade of North Carolina cavalry down the southern bank of the Pamunkey to scout and harass the Union advance wherever possible. During the march, Lee's illness forced him to ride in a carriage. Ewell was also laid up with a similar illness and rode in an ambulance. His condition was serious enough that he was temporarily replaced in command by Major Gen. Jubal Early on May 27th. Union cavalry established a bridgehead over Dabney's Ford on the south side of the Pamunkey River. Brig. Gen. George A. Custer's Michigan Cavalry Brigade scattered the mounted Confederate pickets guarding the ford, and an engineer regiment constructed a pontoon bridge. Custer's men fought a brisk engagement north of Salem Church against Confederate cavalry under Major Gen. Fitzhugh Lee, the 1st Maryland under Call, Bradley T. Johnson, and the Brigade of North Carolinians under Call, John A. Baker. The Confederates withdrew under the pressure of superior numbers. The rest of Torbert's division then crossed the river, followed by Gregg's cavalry division and a division of Union infantry. Lee knew that his best defensive position against Grant would be the low ridge on the southern bank of Totopotomoy Creek, but he was not certain of Grant's specific plans. If Grant was not intending to cross the Pamunkey in force at Hanover Town, the Union Army could outflank him and head directly to Richmond. Lee ordered cavalry under Major Gen. Wade Hampton to make a reconnaissance in force, break through the Union cavalry screen, and find the Union infantry.